Good morning, and good morning, Mr. Connell. We have Mr. Poplett, I think.
Yes, we have, my lord. In the course of today, I'll be seeking to ask about ventilation issues, and then Mr. Poplett will be returning tomorrow to deal with water issues with Mr. McKeever.
With Ms. McKeever. Good morning, Mr. Poplett. As you will recollect, having previously given evidence, you're about to be asked questions by counsel opposite to you. But before you do that, you're prepared to affirm, I understand. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly and sincerely, truly
declare and affirm
that
I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Poplett. Again, as you may recollect, we sit between 10 and 1, take a lunch break, and return again at about 2 o'clock. We will have a coffee break at about 11:30, but if you want to take a break at any stage, just give me an indication and we can take a break. Now, Mr. Connell.
Lord. Good morning, Mr. Poplett. I'm going to use the report that you prepared on the ventilation systems at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, or I may just call it the new hospital to avoid me getting my tongue around the whole title, to take us through today. That we find at Bundle 21, Volume 1, at page 468. So if we go to that report and we start in your executive summary, because we may be able to pick up some of the general issues in the course of that, we find that starting on page 470. Can I just ask a general question, first of all, about ventilation in hospitals? Has ventilation, as part of the exercise of keeping people safe, always had a lot of attention, or has it got more attention now than it used to?
I think the need for ventilation has been known for many, many decades. I think it is fair to say that prior to the COVID pandemic and certain other airborne transmittable diseases, ventilation was not prioritised over some other aspects of building services engineering, partly because of the complexity, partly because of the space and cost involved. But certainly one of, in my opinion, the silver linings, if you'll forgive the expression, of COVID is that it did highlight the risks associated with airborne transmission and the part that ventilation can play in minimising or reducing those risks.
Thank you. Now, there is some challenge of your expertise, and as not everybody will have been present when you previously gave evidence, I'd just like to look briefly at your CV, which we find in an appendix to your report, starting at page 597. So if we could go there, please. And you set out some of your experience, starting on that page, explaining that you were an AE for ventilation, and then at the foot of that page, you start to give us your, as it were, career history. And what we then see, I think, at the top of page 598 is you did actually work in the estates function in hospitals. Is that right?
I spent a total of just over 18 years working for the NHS. I joined as what was then termed a Works Officer 2, now described as an Estates Officer at an operational level. And during those 18 years, worked at a number of trusts in various guises and roles, ending up as a head of estates or head of property and planning at another merged trust.
And that's what you set out in paragraph 13.3 on page 598. And then you explain in 13.4 that you started to practice on your own account, and in particular to practice as an authorising engineer. Is that right?
Correct.
And you now, I see from page 599, AE for quite a lot of healthcare organisations.
I am, yes.
I think in paragraph 13.5 you say 35 to 40, mainly NHS trusts.
Yes, and for some I provide ventilation AE services, for others water, and for some both.
But ventilation seems to be one of the issues that you've had a particular interest in for a long time now, is that correct?
It was, yes. When I first started in the NHS, I was based at Newcastle General Hospital, which had a number of national centres where ventilation was fundamental to the operation. So the viral hemorrhagic fever unit or infectious disease isolation facility and the SCIDS paediatric bone marrow transplant units were both particularly areas that I was heavily involved in.
And then you set out in 13.6 some other material about your background in ventilation, including membership of the Specialist Ventilation in Healthcare Society. So has it always been healthcare and ventilation that you've been involved in?
Yes, other than as a initial apprentice where I was involved in all manner of systems, industrial, commercial, but even then a number of healthcare facilities, and I've worked in almost exclusively healthcare my whole career.
And I think in that capacity you've also authored various guidance notes on different aspects of ventilation, is that correct?
I've written a number of articles and been lead author or contributing author to a number of either supplementary guidelines or HTMs and HPNs.
I think we find some of these for reference on page 601 and then running on to 602, where there's a list. I suspect we don't need to read through them. But I see at the foot of 602 a reference to HTM 0301 of 2021. Were you involved in that?
I was.
But there's a further bibliography, which I suspect we don't need to trouble with. So we can leave your CV and return to your report at page 470 again. Now, this obviously, we're at the stage where you produce an executive summary of your report, but might be helpful to pick up some of the issues. You say in paragraph 1.2 that the decision to install chilled beam systems and as a direct result lower room air change rates and the subsequent impact on potential contamination of patient spaces is clear. So that's something that you're critical of, is that fair?
Yes.
Now, I think you'll be aware that the guidance on chilled beams has changed over the period that we're concerned with in this inquiry, is that correct?
Yes.
And I think the point that might be made against what you say in your report is that at the time that the contracts were let for this hospital, there wasn't a prohibition or anything like it of chilled beams. Do you agree?
Yes, to a point. The psychometry of air and the method in which a chilled beam works will always produce an elevated risk in terms of condensation, which can lead to fungal spore proliferation or bacterial proliferation. So whilst they weren't explicitly excluded recirculating air conditioning units were not recommended in any clinical areas as far back as HTM 2025. So the inference, if you will, whilst chilled beams weren't specifically noted as not being appropriate, was certainly evidence back in the 90s that they had risks associated with them.
Now you go on to say in this further, in the same, as it were, preliminary paragraph or summary paragraph, that you say the extent of the resulting clinical infection risk is outside the scope of your report. Now, obviously, you don't claim to be a clinician. Are you in a position to quantify the risk or not?
Not in any sort of statistical basis. Any clinical or even microbiological experience I've only acquired as a result of engineering input and working with a range of microbiologists and clinicians over the years. So I cannot quantify the elevation in clinical risk, but I am confident that a lower air change rate, a lower dilution rate, and the presence of sources which can encourage proliferation would be detrimental in a clinical setting.
Now, in preparing your report, you've obviously been provided with a range of materials by the inquiry documents of one kind or another. Can I ask you to look at a document in bundle 12 at page 813? Now, this is an email written by Mr. Seaborn in 2016, so some years after the hospital contract was let and after it had been opened, which is addressed to a variety of people, which doesn't matter for present purposes. But have you had occasion to have a look at this?
I have.
Now, I think one of the criticisms that you make in paragraph 1.2, you say that, in your opinion, the failure to involve all stakeholders and ensure a multidisciplinary review approach contributed to a suboptimal final design. Now, Mr. Seaborn seems to suggest in this email that there was some kind of involvement of different disciplines. Does that cause you to question your conclusion?
It doesn't question my conclusion. The question would be, was the engagement thorough enough and looked at all aspects? Because in my opinion, if it had, then it would have come up with an alternative design solution.
So it may be, I mean, I think it's a matter largely not in dispute now that there is no documentary material available to the inquiry, as confirmed in the evidence of one of the board's witnesses, which bears on the air change rate decision back in the day. First of all, can I just ask you, does the absence of documentation mean that you shouldn't make any conclusion on this until somebody tells you orally what may or may not have happened?
It is, I've based my opinion on the information that was available to me. If additional or contrary information is available and produced, then it may impact upon it, but it wouldn't change my fundamental view that the air change rate and the provision of these devices in certainly acute clinical areas was inappropriate.
Yeah, well, let's leave that document and return, please, to the report at the same page. Because what you then go on to do and I accept this is the summary, is you set out a list in paragraph 1.3 of what you describe as principal areas of concern, low air change rates, use of chill beams, and we'll come to some of these in more detail later. Inconsistent provision of HEPA filters, lack of air permeability testing, commissioning process, lack of independent validation. We'll come to derogations later, and then PPM and resources and a ventilation safety group. Now, in 1.4, you say this: the overall ventilation strategy was non-compliant to what you describe as the basic principles of healthcare ventilation as outlined in SHTM 0301. Now, first of all, I take it you're aware that there are technically different guidance documents for Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Yes.
And probably as a matter of practice, your main dealings have been with the UK versions rather than the Scottish ones. Is that right?
Correct.
In any event, are you, having had an opportunity of thinking about it and having, considered everything that's happened, are you content with your view that the overall strategy was non-compliant to the basic principles?
I am.
And then you go on to say, and as I say, we'll come to some of these points in a little more detail later, the point that we know that general ward areas were designed to achieve minimum standard of 6, were not designed to achieve minimum standard of 6, some specialist areas not designed to achieve clinically appropriate standards, and the ventilation design appears to have been driven by a desire to achieve BREEAM, and we'll come back to BREEAM a little later in your report. And you say a lack of understanding of critical clinical risks associated with the ventilation system. Why do you say that all of this suggests a lack of understanding?
The SHTM makes clear the minimum levels of ventilation that should be provided. They weren't. So the conclusion I drew is that they were either assessed as not being critical and therefore could be lowered without any increased risk, or that they were deliberately overlooked to achieve alternate priorities. My current belief, and remains the case, that I believe that it was informed based upon trying to conform to one legitimate standard to achieve BREEAM excellence at the expense of providing an appropriate clinical environment in terms of ventilation.
Now, what would you say at the foot of that page is that it provided a suboptimal patient care environment from a ventilation perspective? Now, I think one possible criticism of your report might be that you're only talking about the ventilation perspective and you're not thinking about everything else that might be done to look after a patient in a room. Is that correct?
Yes, my specialty area is ventilation, and that is the focus of the report.
And the way you carry on dealing with chilled beams at the foot of that page and then the top of 472 is you say that the use of chill beams influenced the suboptimal airflow performances and added an avoidable risk, and that's the point you just made a few minutes ago. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then you say the design was recognized as an issue after occupation as some works were commissioned. However, these failed to address all of the original design deficiencies and some remain in a suboptimal state. Now we'll come to take the details of which are in the suboptimal state, but is that your view about the ventilation systems at this hospital?
Yes, it is.
Bear with me a second. Can I just ask one further question about chilled beams, since we've got them sort of out here? There's been some evidence suggesting there's been quite a change in the attitude to chilled beams in the different ventilation guidance documents. Do you think there's been a major shift in approach?
Personally, no, I don't believe so, and particularly not within healthcare settings.
Well, let's go on. We'll look at some of the details, and we'll come to the suboptimal areas in due course. I think the argument that stands that is made against you, Mr. Poplett, is that you say, well, this area is suboptimal, but someone else may say, well, we're taking precaution A or precaution B, or we're using PPE or whatever the step is that's envisaged to try to keep patients safe. So actually, in the result, there isn't a suboptimal area. How do you respond to that criticism?
Ventilation plays one part in managing the risk. It is by no means the only means available, and there are others that play a part. If the conscious decision was taken to lower the ventilation rates, then I would expect to see a corresponding risk assessment to highlight what mitigation has been put in place to offset or compensate for the suboptimal performance of the ventilation. I haven't seen clear evidence of that risk assessment process in the evidence that I've reviewed.
Thank you. Right, well, let's move on from, we're still dealing in general terms with a number of the issues before we come into the detail. The next outline section you deal with is commissioning and validation. I needn't ask you about commissioning at the moment, and there's no dispute now that there was no independent validation done. So I'll touch on that a little later. I mean, you say you haven't seen any validation documentation. Well, I don't think there's any real issue now that there isn't any, because validation wasn't actually done. I suppose the argument might be, well, we don't know why. We know it's not there, but so far we don't know why validation wasn't done. Would that cause you to change any of your comments?
No.
It's about the point that you make, as other witnesses have made at the foot of page 472 in paragraph 1.7, is that the intended function, am I right, of validation is to allow the customer, as it were, the healthcare customer, to decide whether it can accept the system and proceed to operate it. Is that right?
I think it does that, certainly. It also, building services engineering systems often interact with one another. And the validation process is also intended to prove that whilst each system has been successfully commissioned, they also interact appropriately with one another. So an example would be the fire control strategy, fire smoke control dampers work as they should with the ventilation systems. So validation isn't just proving that you've got what you paid for, it's also set to prove that all of the various systems interact and don't interfere with one another or work as they should do.
Thank you. Well, we'll move on to the next page of your report. Again, you're outlining issues that we'll see at least some of a little later on in more detail. Operational issues. You say that in the initial period, some of these things didn't seem to be managed very well. You make some comments on audit reports, which I'd like to come back to separately. And then you set out in paragraph 1.10 your assumption that the process of the derogation, and I know I'll take that from you a little later, I know you're concerned about derogations generally. You assume that this was restricted to a project board level. Now, as you remember, Mr. Poplett, one of the processes that's been carried out in relation to the evidence at this inquiry is that questions were put to you in writing at an earlier stage, and you were given the chance to respond in writing. And one question was put to you about that. So if we could go to Bundle 21, Volume 6, at page 146. And then we'll go, in fact, to page 147. And this is your response to a question in relation to paragraph 1.10 of your report, which I've just raised with you. And you were saying what information was from clinical teams was provided relating to the ventilation specification. And then you explained to us what you had in order to reach that view. Is that right?
Correct.
And I suppose the important part of your answer might be thought to be the last part of 2.2. Is that right?
Yes.
So you're working on the basis of the material it provided to you, and you haven't seen anything to support it going back to these parties.
No.
Now, what you then touch on, if we go back to your report at 473, what you then touch on is the general question, well, okay, you've identified some issues, what could be done about them? We see there in the succeeding paragraphs a number of points. I'll take this opportunity, since we've got this in front of us, just to make sure that we work through each of these. But your recommendation starts, I think, at the top of page 474. So if you've got what you describe as a suboptimal situation relating to ventilation, your first recommendation is a full multidisciplinary assessment of the speciality. Is that correct?
Correct.
Just help us understand why that's the first step.
In my opinion, what we need to look to is to assess the risk posed or otherwise by the current ventilation performance with input from clinical specialities, infection prevention control, estates and others to identify what level of risk the current performance poses and what can practically be achieved and what improvement or reduction in risk could be achieved for what level of clinical disruption.
Now, you end paragraph 1.12 by suggesting that minimum performance standards should be informed from the current SHTM. Is that correct? So you would still have this discussion focus on that guidance document. Is that correct?
As the baseline, yes.
And then you would say in 113 that the next step following this assessment is to try and work out what would need to be done.
Yeah.
And you suggest there possibly removal of chilled beams from clinical areas. Is that something you're suggesting?
It is one of the options. I wouldn't understate or underestimate the potential disruption or financial consequences of that decision. But if the risk assessment highlights that the reduced level of ventilation and the presence of chilled beam in certain clinical areas could only be addressed by their removal, then that would be my advice.
Now, I think we've had other evidence, for instance, that with these chill beam unit, you can't just turn a dial and improve the the air change rate in the room or anything of that kind. Probably the biggest learning about ventilation systems, Mr. Poplett, that we've had so far, which is that it's not like a central heating radiator. You can't just say it's a bit cold, let's turn it from 2 to 6. You can't do that with air change rates, is that right?
That is correct.
And you go on to say not only the possibility of removing chilled beams, but also possibly replacing ventilation plant. As we go on later to touch on, for instance, as was done in Ward 2A. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then that, of course, would then raise the question of, can you do that while the ward is still functioning, depending on the works?
This is where it becomes a technical assessment to simply increase the air change rate within the room. Obviously relates directly to the sizing of the ventilation ductwork and the velocity at which air travels through it, noise transmission, drafts and comfort factors for patients, not to mention that you cannot operate chilled beams at the increased ventilation rate of 6 air changes an hour for a general ward area. So it is not a straightforward, we can just pull it out and turn the fan up, as you say. It may well require decanting or removal of a clinical space from operational use whilst those works are undertaken, and with much larger plant to provide an increased airflow rates, the whole practicality in question of plant room sizes and location of plant will also play a practical implication to that decision-making process.
I think that the board would say it's not right that you should reach these conclusions because this is going to worry people about what they've got at the moment. How do you respond to that criticism?
It's very difficult to say that the existing system is adequate when it doesn't meet the current stated minimum standards. Now, if adequate mitigation is provided, that the multidisciplinary risk assessment states that they are safe and appropriate, that would be fine. But from a ventilation perspective, I stand by my position that they are currently suboptimal.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to 475. I think you've I'll just deal with these very briefly. In passing in 1.18, you're basically saying you may need some more estates people who are appropriately qualified to help with these processes. And in 119, you're suggesting an increase in the audit frequency. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, we've dealt with all of that actually under the summary at the start of the report. If we can then just go in and pick up what your report itself does. Scope is dealt with on that page, and on the next page you've set out any assumptions and limitations, and then you start with an overview. So this is really you starting to lay a background for the material that you then set out later on, is that right?
Correct.
So on 477, you list the functions that the ventilation system in a healthcare premises fulfill, is that right?
Correct.
Now, I needn't ask you about all of that. On 478, you're just about to go on to deal with the different contaminants that may be involved. Where asked one question about contaminants in the course of the earlier process, it might be convenient just to check your answer now. So if we go back to your Direction 5 questions in Bundle 21, Volume 6, again at page 147, you'll see you were asked a question at the foot of that page, whether bacterial pathogens generated from non-human sources, for example, water dispersal, have a bearing on the bioburden in a clinical space. Now we see your answer in 148, which you preface by saying this is primarily for a clinical or infection transmission issue and not strictly engineering, but you offer a view. Now, can I just ask you, you made the qualification, but you nevertheless offer a view. Why are you in a position to offer a view on that topic as a ventilation, as what, at least on the face of it, is a ventilation engineer?
Because as part of my role as an AE for ventilation, I have spent many years being involved with and working with microbiologists, IPC specialists, and am confident in the statement made in 3.2 as being accurate. For specific evidence of the accuracy, I would defer to clinical or infection specialists. But as an AE for ventilation, I've worked with a number of microbiologists, IPC professionals over 30 years plus, and this has consistently been evidenced as one of the sources or reasons why ventilation can improve or reduce the risk of transmission.
And basically what you say there is, well, you have the shedding of skin scales and you have breathing, with all that no doubt entails, but then you touch on other sources, external air, water sources, aerolization of droplets and so on. So these are the things you've come up with in your discussions over the years.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we go back to 478 of your report, we're dealing there with a section which I suspect we've had some other evidence on about the size of particles that one has to deal with and what they are. You set out in 5.5 reference to viruses and bacteria. Bacteria, the most common transmission mechanism is skin scales, is that right?
It is certainly one of them via the airborne route. They tend to travel on skin scales through the airborne transmission route.
And then in going on to 479, you touch on fungal spores, which we've heard something about elsewhere. Apparently they can live for a long time according to your material, is that right?
Yes, they can.
And you also give an indication of the size, which might be helpful. You say that they're usually between 2 and 5 microns, whereas a human hair diameter is 70 to 100 microns. So very small then.
Hence the term microorganisms. But yes.
Thank you. Now you can't go on in that section of your report to touch on possible sources such as building work and so on. And you make the point, which I don't think is controversial, that many of the organisms in the air are breathed in by healthy people all the time without ill effects, but may have dramatic effects on those who are not so healthy.
Correct, yes.
And then you touch on ventilation as a means of dealing with this. Just a very small point on page 480. Yes, you're talking about there about possible infection arising from a clinical inspection process, if I can call it that, being carried out on a patient who has or potentially has tuberculosis, and then you say about halfway down paragraph 5.8, the recommendation advice would be low-level extraction immediately behind the area where the patient is being treated, because you don't want anyone else breathing in anything that comes from that process. And you say any particulate that is expelled gets drawn away to low level and extracted from the room, rather than passing through the staff breathing zone on its way to an extract grill in the ceiling. Now, the short point that's being suggested is that when you say any particulate, would that be every particulate? I mean, do you manage to get everything in such a process?
No, you wouldn't within this arrangement. Typically, if you wish to capture all or the vast majority of particulates, then you would be looking at a local exhaust ventilation system, not a general ventilation system. The design suggested within this for an endoscopic unit is based upon improving, not eliminating, release of potential pathogenic particles.
Thank you. Now, in the next immediately following sections of your report, you touch briefly on humidity, and then you go on to deal with different types of ventilation and what the different types mean. And I don't think we need to take up time going there. If we could move to page 483, just because this is a topic that keeps cropping up almost every time anyone mentions ventilation. It's this issue of air change rates and litres per second, and why one and not the other, and so on. Now, you touch on that there. You say that litres per second used to be the measure that was deployed in guidance. Is that right?
Yes.
And why did people decide to change it and use ACH?
Because the litres per second guidance that is referenced in a SHTM 2025 relates to a standard theatre size. So at a given room size, the litres per second equated to 20 air changes an hour. However, if you build the room to a different size, it would arguably be either overventilated or, more worryingly, underventilated if you stick to a straightforward litres per second provision. So the two are different ways of measuring the same thing, really. But the air change rate accommodates the specific room size, whereas a litres per second, if it's put into a very small room, will have a far greater air change rate than if it is provided into a very large space. So it was deemed as more appropriate, is my understanding, that air change rates could be universally applied to any room without having to go back to first principle calculation to achieve the required air change rates.
So you can determine that whatever space you're using, it should have whatever number of air changes you think are appropriate.
Correct.
And then, again, we might just take this from you since it's conveniently close by. On page 484, you touch on a reference to research by Lidwell, which is the much quoted early research on ventilation in healthcare. Is that correct?
Correct.
That one air change, assuming it's evenly distributed, removes 63% of airborne contamination, and subsequent air changes 63% of what's left. Can I just ask, is that still regarded as a useful measure to have in mind?
I certainly believe so, and it was the basis of many of the calculations undertaken during COVID, so very recently, as being an appropriate method for working out things such as fallow times in between patients.
And of course, the calculation assumes that during the calculation period, you're not introducing another contaminant. Otherwise, things get more complicated, presumably.
Correct.
And presumably, it's also dependent on how you're moving the air around the space that you're dealing with. Is that correct?
It does. An air change needs to account for all of the air within the space. So if it was introduced in one corner and sucked out at the same corner, you wouldn't get total room dilution. So the positioning of terminal devices such as grills is critical to make sure that you get full room clearance and we don't get dead spots or stale air pockets within a given area.
So that presumably applies also to where, if you're introducing air into the room, where it comes from, as well as where you're extracting it from.
Yes.
I might just pick up briefly another point that you made. You may have touched on this a little earlier, page 486. At the foot of that page, you say the ventilation parameters are codependent and interlinked. Now, in the preceding section, you've been discussing the practicalities of a lot of the ventilation exercises. What do you mean by parameters are codependent and interlinked within a healthcare setting?
Depending upon what you want to use the clinical space for, determines the appropriate level of ventilation required. So an operating theatre, as an example, has a far higher air change rate than a treatment room or indeed a patient bed space. The challenge comes from the broad terms used in the SHTM to describe treatment room, as an example, and a treatment can be anything from changing a sticking plaster to interventional wound dressing or interventional clinical activity. So they always need to be assessed as to how you are going to use the room, what you are using the room for, the vulnerability of the patient group that is going to be present, how many people are likely to be present, which will inform the level of bioburden potential within the air, the duration or size, duration of procedure, size of any incision, all linked and should inform the ventilation rate. That level of detail could never be adequately captured within a standard SHTM document, so they are given as broad terms, and then it is the multidisciplinary risk assessment that should be used if you wish to deviate from those levels and document why you are deviating and the likely implications of it.
And then you make a point just thereafter, which is probably self-explanatory, to the effect that, well, if you change the supplier extract, then that has an impact on pressure and so on. I don't need you to go through that. But can we go to 487? So I can ask you a general question, please. At 5.32, you say SHTM 0301 and no doubt HTM 0301 also outlines the purpose of ventilation in healthcare premises and so on. First question, is it always about protecting the patient, or are there any others that need to be considered?
No, the staff also require protection. If you have an infectious disease, then you don't want that transmitted to staff. Again, back to the example that we used earlier, if you have a patient with suspected TB, whilst you're undertaking the endoscopic procedure, by its very nature, the staff have to be in close proximity to that source, and they need adequate protection to minimise their risk of exposure.
Now, you rely on SHTM 0301, and as I said, we know that it mirrors the guidance elsewhere in the UK in the HTMs. The suggestion is that although that guidance has been around now since about 2005 or thereabouts in similar form, there's really nothing available to support it being of any value at all in protecting patients and staff and visitors. There's no evidence to support the argument that an SHTM 0301 compliance system is any better or worse than one that isn't. Do you have any view on that?
I think it's incredibly hard to prove a negative. So you would have to undertake independent evidence-based research to demonstrate that an alternate design, be it lower than or higher than those outlined within the SHTM, were beneficial or detrimental or had neutral impact. To the best of my knowledge, that hasn't been undertaken. And I think from an ethical position would never be able to be undertaken, in that, well, it doesn't matter, we can turn it down a bit and we'll reach a point where we start to see a problem and then turn it back up a notch. That isn't how ventilation systems work.
I mean, in your practice, first of all in estates and thereafter as a consultant and as an AE, is the guidance in SHTM 0301, or more likely in your case HTM 0301, are they in practice used as a standard?
Yes.
Just a small point again, as we move on to 488. It's in the middle of paragraph 5.33. I just wanted to make sure we understand the point you're making there. You say the whole of HTM 0301 is written specifically for acute care medicine, but it doesn't require an A&E department to be an acute care facility. What's the point you're trying to make here? It's about 2/3 of the way down 5.33.
The A&E department is the receiving area within a hospital. You don't know what people have or what they haven't got upon arrival in A&E. It is not automatically going to be an area where acute care is provided. It is where an assessment will take place as to whether that patient then goes on into the hospital or not. It is certainly the case that the HTM and indeed SHTM are based around acute care rather than a primary care or community hospital location. And certainly it's explicit that places such as dental practices, GP, mental health facilities need to assess the appropriateness of the HTM in light of the likely patient group and vulnerabilities that they will be caring for.
Then you give in the next example an operating theatre which might have a figure of 22 suggested, but have a lot of kit in it, which is generating a lot of heat, which might on assessment mean you'd need more, is that right?
Correct.
More air changes.
Yes.
Then on the next page, 489, this may or may not ultimately be of importance to this inquiry, that what happens if you have a clinical activity which is not precisely defined in the HTM? What do you do then about the guidance?
That is where the multidisciplinary team would make an assessment of the nature of the specific clinical activity and assign or decide on the appropriate ventilation strategy. Their are an awful lot of, or a number of, examples given within the current version of 0301, where if there isn't a direct comparison, you should be able to draw a comparison to a similar activity. Again, it relates back to the type of treatment rooms I was discussing earlier.
At the foot of that page, you make the same point about others that may need protection, and your example there is to look at it the other way around and say if you've got a dentist and a dental nurse in a room, they may be there for a long time, whereas the patients are in and out. But can I ask you just to look back at your Direction 5 questions in the Bundle 21, Volume 6 bundle for a moment, just to pick up on a question that was asked so we can see your answer, page 148. Question 4. Essentially what you're being asked there is about the significance of patient placement policy and the need or potential need for accurate information about the precise accommodation that you're going to be placing the patient into. Now, you seem in your answer to think that that is important.
Yes.
And is that because you need to understand the individual ventilation parameters of any particular room into which a patient is going to be placed?
I would say that you need to understand the clinical risk to the patient to make sure that the space is appropriate for where you are placing that patient. You must have an understanding and awareness of the ventilation as one element, and as I say, I concentrate primarily on ventilation, but it needs to have enough electrical socket outlets. They need to be emergency generator backed up if necessary. There's a whole myriad of stuff. You can't just say, I have a patient, I have a room, therefore I can put that patient into that room. It needs to be done in coordination and knowledge of what the room and how the room performs, what services are present, and what that patient is likely to need.
If we go back to your report, at page 490, you're making the point that the air change rates have been as they stand for some time now. And then what you do in your report is you go on to explain as a practical and engineering sense, what's actually involved in a ventilation system, all the different steps that exist in that process. And for present purposes, I'm not going to ask you to go to that. You deal with everything from where the air comes in, what happens to it next, and so on. And in fact, you go on, starting at page 493, even to look at the type of materials that are deployed to construct these. I just wanted to pause briefly at page 495 because we start to pick up here some of the issues that we'll see when we look at individual areas, one of which is the idea of backup or that kind of issue for certain areas. Is that a significant issue in ventilation provisions?
Yes. Where ventilation plays a critical role to maintaining a safe environment, there needs to be a level of resilience to accommodate unplanned service interruptions.
Now, what you then do is go on to touch on another topic that the inquiry has heard a bit about on page 497, which is permeability testing, which is, I think someone described it as not ascertaining whether it doesn't leak, but whether it only leaks within parameters that have been laid down in the tests. Is that right?
Yes.
And then on 499, we now come to the ventilation strategy for the hospital that we're concerned with. And you start at that stage to look at the documents that we've been calling the M&E clarification log, the documents that record the decision to make the air change rate 2.5 or thereabouts, and you've actually quoted large sections of that in your report. And the 8 litres per second that's referred to there, you say is a building standard rather than a healthcare standard.
Correct.
But I just want to pick up your comment on this, so we're clear about it. On page 500, you say in the middle of paragraph 6.6 that you've assumed that the ventilation strategy for single rooms was designed to comply with a particular building standard, not SHTMO 301. I consider this assumption to be likely correct, as that's what was in the document. And then you offer a view. Just explain what your view is about that decision.
There were and still are competing priorities or contradictory priorities, you could argue, regarding making sure that buildings are as energy efficient as possible, but they also still need to be appropriate for their intended use. The building regulations minimum ventilation standards are that. They are minimum ventilation standards, not maximum. And by prioritising an energy target over their clinical activity is fundamentally incorrect, in my opinion. A hospital is there to treat patients, and we need to make sure that it is specifically designed with that as its first priority. The energy it uses needs to be minimised for obvious reasons, both financial and global, but it is not at the expense of the appropriateness of that environment for its intended purpose.
Thank you. And what you then do is you list on page 501 a number of the issues that arise from this that you've discovered as you've looked at the material. Low air change rates, lack of HEPA filtration, inadequate pressure differentials, chilled beams, spaces not sealed, air handling that's close to capacity, no standby, and the ventilation system not being validated. Now you touch on chilled beams, which we've had quite a lot about. 6.9 on page 501. I'm not sure we need to deal with all of this, but your position is there was always a cautionary note. Is that right, about chilled beams?
Correct.
I suppose if one thinks about it, does something depend on how often you think you might have to clean them as to whether they're appropriate for a patient room?
Yes, and chill beams require a relatively high level of maintenance, and that maintenance may well have to be carried out with the patient present. So you are introducing further sources of contamination by the maintenance activity in doing that maintenance. But it also is fundamentally linked to the total air change rate where a chilled beam will function, and that is lower than the minimum air change rates specified within SHTM.
And then you pick up a number of issues that you've identified on page 502, the provision of HEPA filters, and we know what they do, room pressure differentials, where you have the requirement for positive or negative pressure depending on the type of protection. We'll come back to a debate about Ward 4C later, and then the air handling units, that from an engineering perspective must be one of the significant issues. Can the air handling unit do what you want it to do? And the point you're identifying here is, well, what happens if they're already close to capacity? Is that right?
Yes, and it is fair to say that a brand new unit working at 100% capacity will lose some degree of performance over time due to wear and tear.
And then you go on page 503 to say that you've been unable to identify any evidence of provision for backup air handling plant. Well, we'll come to the ward that was refurbished later. But so the air handling unit would need to be shut down. And that's the point that you were making earlier. Can I just ask you, for completeness, to go back to your direction 5 questions for a moment? So we're still on page 148 of that document. And we'll just look at question 5. Essentially, I think the question you're being asked there is, have you seen anything to cover, you know, what the risk assessment was when, for one reason or another, you had to turn the air handling unit off? And the answer to that question is what? Have you seen any such evidence?
No, I haven't.
Actually, just while we have that document open, can I just ask you about the next question, which seems to be focused on the ceiling space, and that, of course, depends on the permeability of the room, which we'll touch on shortly. But the question you're asked is, how does the ingress of dust and spores from a ceiling space impact on the risk of infection for immunosuppressed patients? And you deal with that on page 149. You make the same qualification. Is the basis on which you're able to answer that the same as the last basis you gave me?
It is, yes.
And basically you say, well, this is why you have solid ceilings. Is that right?
Correct.
Does the solid ceiling also impact the ability to maintain the pressure?
It can, you can, it very much depends upon where you take the envelope of the room or suite that you are air permeability testing. You can take it floor to soffit, or you can take it floor to ceiling level. But obviously, if you take it floor to soffit and you are including the space above, say, a suspended ceiling, then that suspended ceiling should be kept, as far as is reasonably practicable, as clean as the overall room, because otherwise dust will travel from one area to the other.
And I think if we go back to your report at 503, you pick up the fact that there were suspended ceiling tiles deployed in some areas, which were then removed and replaced with jointless ceilings. Is that what you would have expected to find where there were immunosuppressed patients?
Yes.
So if we go then to page 504 of your report, you point out that the SHTM or HTM provides guidance for lots of areas, but it's not possible to lay them out for everything.
Correct.
And you suggest how, if the precise area is not specified in detail in the guidance, how that should be resolved.
Yes.
And is that this multidisciplinary discussion that you've instanced earlier?
It is.
And your conclusion at the foot of that page is that the overall ventilation strategy was non-compliant to the basic principles, and that's the point that you made in answer to a question earlier. And then we go on to look at different wards. Your point on general wards, as I understand it, is twofold. One, they're not providing 6 air changes, and secondly, that they are arguably not compliant with guidance on chill beams either.
Correct.
Now, 2A is the one ward that we know, excuse me, we know a lot of work was done on. But your conclusion on page 505 is you thought it had been built a bit like a general ward, is that right?
That was the impression I got, yes.
And then you point out that you've seen a report by IDS listing the various issues with the Ward 2A. I don't suppose you can help us as to how Ward 2A was built in that state, because that predates your involvement.
It does.
Now, can I ask you then to look at paragraph 7.6 on page 506, because patients were moved out, a lot of work was done, and you report on that in your report there. You say it's HEPA filtered bedrooms, corridors, all rooms specified 10 ACH plus 10 pascals, chilled beams and suspended ceilings removed, all rooms sealed, airlocked to the ward, and so on. I mean, so far as that specification for that patient cohort, after that work has been done, would you regard that as satisfactory?
In general terms, yes.
Do you have any qualifications for that, or not?
Not without a further or refreshed detailed review of its current design layout, but those are the minimum standards that I would expect to see in a ward of this type.
Thank you. I might just ask you about that. Have you seen wards for that type of patient cohort with higher standards than that?
You can increase both air change rate and pressure differentials. Bigger isn't necessarily better, because it can introduce problems operationally, getting doors to close and stay closed. But also when doors are open, you can get back eddies and you can introduce problems. If it is airlocked and at a general 10 pascal positive pressure to surrounding areas, that is appropriate. Could you operate it at 15? Yes, you could. Could you operate it at 20? Yes. But at that stage, you are probably going to find operational difficulties and encourage bad practice, such as wedging doors open because they're so difficult to open or close. So it is unusual to see the standards exceeded unless there's a specific reason. So something like equipment that gives off a high heat gain, you may look to increase the air change rate to achieve disbursement or cooling of that area. But generally speaking, you would operate it to the 1010 standard.
Thank you. Can I just ask you then the associated question that was raised in your Direction 5 process? So if we go to page 149 of the question document, question 7, I take it you're familiar with the phrase high scribe or HAI scribe. That is the source of question 7 on that page.
Not specifically, but it's healthcare acquired infection guidance.
I think the question is, have you seen any material to show that there was an IPC sign-off for the works for that Ward 2A?
No, I hadn't.
But you would expect some involvement, presumably, in that process.
I would.
Fine, we've moved back to your report, page 507. Now, this is Ward 2B, so Ward 2A is the inpatient ward. This has daycare patients. And you say an airlock was incorporated in 2019, HEPA filter air provided in the corridor. Now, do you have any view on whether this should be treated as a general ward or a ward with special steps because of the immunosuppressed patients?
Again, that is really something that is outside my purview as an engineer. The patients concerned are, for want of a better term, out in the general community and not given specialist precautions as such, but they are still immunosuppressed and are at elevated risk of infection. It would not be unusual to ensure that whilst receiving healthcare treatment, they were in a HEPA filtered environment. But arguably, if they've come to their appointment on the bus and gone round Tesco's beforehand, then they are not at excessive vulnerability to general airborne contamination risk.
But presumably, while they're in the care of the hospital, as it were, there's a question as to what protections they should be given while they're in that environment.
Yes, and you also have the situation whereby the individuals may well be taking additional precautions whilst out in the community, and they are then, when they're within the healthcare setting, mixing with people who may not have taken those same precautions or may be carrying asymptomatic infection, and therefore it would not be unreasonable to ensure that that was a safe and appropriate environment for them.
The next section that you deal with is 4B, which, as we know, is the adult bone marrow transplant area. And you make the point, which we know about, that this wasn't part of the original design, but was added laterally. Now you pick up at the foot of page 507 what you think the requirements are for patients of this kind. Is that right?
Correct.
So this is 1010, as you put it earlier. And then when you refer to the Beatson facility, is that you're referring to the area in which these patients were housed before they came to the new hospital?
That is my understanding, yes.
And then you identify a series of deficiencies on page 508, the air change rate 6, rooms not at positive pressure, HEPA filters in patient bedrooms, not in corridors, no pressure alarms, no airlock, and suspended ceilings, therefore rooms not sealed. Now you understand that some works have been done to that area. Has that removed all of the deficiencies that you identify?
I don't believe it's removed all of them. It is still operating at a lower than ideal air change rate. And as I understand it, there are also still areas with suspended ceilings present. I also haven't seen the full information on air permeability testing.
4C, so we're again in a situation where 4B is for the BMT patients. 4C has what are described as hemato-oncology patients, and your understanding it on 509 is that these may also be those with suppressed immune systems.
Correct.
And again, it was designed as a general ward. 720, you say, well, this ward is still at 2.5 air changes, not HEPA filtered rooms at neutral pressure. Just pausing there, from your perspective, is that a satisfactory situation or not?
In my experience, I would not expect that to be used for this patient group without significant other mitigation deployed to address it. But again, this is really a question that a multidisciplinary group should answer rather than myself from a purely ventilation perspective.
And we've had some discussion about the value or otherwise of mobile HEPA filters, ranging from, well, they can't do any harm to they're not validated. Do you have a view as an EE and previous estates leader?
I do. I think there is a general lack of independent evidence-based research on their efficacy. From my work with them in recent years, they are highly dependent upon where they are located in a given room, the area that they can effectively cover, and they can be subject to external alteration or interference. If the thing's on wheels and it gets in the way that a nurse needs to get to a bed head or drip stand or monitor, then they will get moved out of the way. I have certainly come across them in hospitals where they've been moved out into corridors or even out into the staff room. I've come across them where they've been switched off because they're noisy and a patient can't sleep. And when you service or clean them, there is currently no prescribed international standard for testing the integrity of that filter when it is changed. So if they are tested at production, and they tend to only be sample tested, then the ongoing verification of their performance, their location in the room, and their appropriate commissioning, validation, and then ongoing verification is currently not adequately documented or standardized.
In the next section, you touch on Ward 6A, which we know was used for the 2A patients for a while. Can I just ask you about another piece of kit that's mentioned in paragraph 7.23, which is described as a CamFill recirculating scrubber. Now, are you familiar with what that is?
Yes.
Do you have any view as to its value or otherwise?
The advantage of a fixed location air cleaning device or scrubber is that it can't be subject to interference or movement within the room. But again, they have to be properly assessed and commissioned to ensure that they do achieve what are described as equivalent air changes. And again, they have to be suitably maintained. And when filters are changed, then the integrity of those filters and the seals needs to be verified in some way.
In fact, there was not a heading. You then turn to look at some wards on level 5, and in particular the issue about infectious diseases. And you point out that this ventilation system at level 5 was designed to achieve 2.5 air changes an hour and a nominally negative pressure. Now, what do you write in saying that 7.26 that there are particular parameters for all infectious diseases bedrooms or just for some?
Infectious diseases bedrooms are classified by the nature of the infectious disease that they are intended to house. As I believe I go on to describe, there are high consequence infectious diseases where the standards for their ventilation is not clearly published or defined, but is controlled centrally through Porton Down. Less serious infectious diseases can be treated in a range of rooms, but where you have a designated isolation room, there are specific standards laid out in HBN 0401 Supplement 1 for the ventilation performance of those spaces.
And then presumably there must be another level. If it's not something that needs the very, very specialized unit, it's not something that needs the special isolation room type protection. Presumably there are then infectious diseases which are treated in the ward.
Practically, in day-to-day healthcare, a single side room without specific ventilation can be highly effective in terms of providing or minimizing the risk of exposure of an infection. If you have a patient with flu or indeed norovirus or a similar airborne transmittable disease, then where you don't have a specific isolation facility, a side room would be the first option and the preference as to where to house them. Not as efficient, not as fundamentally safe as a full isolation room, but practically available and reasonable and safe to use.
Thank you. And then you say on page 511 you list what the infectious disease unit has, including access to 3 negative pressure rooms. You say at the foot, this performance is below the minimum standards. Why do you say that?
Because they don't meet the standards laid out in HBN 0401 Supplement 1 for isolation facilities, which is 1010.
Now what you go on to do after that section is you touch in general terms on a number of the issues. You touch on lack of HEPA filtration, and I don't need to take you through that. You touch on inadequate room pressure differentials. This did crop up in some other evidence. I'd just like to ask you briefly about that. One can understand that if you have 10 pascals, or whatever, as a target, or +5 or whatever, there's a significant difference between that and that changing to an unsatisfactory situation. Is there any particular issue that arises when you have a positive or negative pressure which is around about that 0 point, -1 or something like that? Does that give rise to any particular issues?
What you are describing is a room that would be at neutral pressure, for want of a better term. It is neither positive nor negative to a surrounding or adjacent room. You will get minimum air transference through that arrangement, which are the fundamental principles of the PPVL style isolation room. The room is at neutral pressure to surrounding areas. The positive pressure is created in the lobby and the negative in the ensuite or extracted from the room directly. A pascal is a very, very small measurement of air pressure. So if it is 1 or 2 pascals in either direction, it is probably close to being neutral in practice. The reason 10, or one of the reasons that 10 is specified, is, as is referenced in terms of air permeability, it allows for a degree of natural leakiness while still maintaining the desired direction of airflow.
Thank you. Now, the next topic you touch on is air permeability, and you set out in 7.36 material that we have a little of. You can have several rooms. You can have positively pressured room, negative pressure rooms, and then PPVL rooms. And you say on 514 that you can use the PPVL design, at least potentially, for both immunocompromised and infectious patients. Is that correct?
Correct.
Does that depend on the precise setup of the room, the precise way it's designed, where the intake and extract is, and so on?
It doesn't rely on positioning of supply and extract as long as it's set up as laid out in the HBN. The PPVL will operate the room as I say, at neutral pressure. Its appropriateness for immunosuppressed patients can be influenced by the quality of the supply air filtration. So if you have a patient who's particularly vulnerable from ubiquitous airborne pathogens, aspergillus, etc., then it would need to be HEPA filtered. For an infectious disease patient, it wouldn't necessarily need to be HEPA filtered. And indeed, we recommend within the HBN that for the PPVL room to have the best resilience in use, we should not be putting any form of filtration on the exhaust air, because that will introduce a system resistance that in the event of an extract fan failure would interfere with the open air path to outside.
Well, can I just ask you we'll just perhaps finish this point by asking you to look at your Direction 5 answers, just so we're clear about this. On page 149, you're asked, can PPVL rooms be used for specialist IDU unit? And you set out there, I think, something largely along the lines of evidence you gave us a little earlier about it depends what kind of infectious diseases you're planning for.
Yes.
And the ones that need very specialist facilities, are they the HCID?
High consequence infectious diseases.
Right. And then you're asked, can you use PPVL rooms for specialist BMT units? And is that the answer you've just given us about?
Yes.
Depends on the air supply.
As provided that the supply air is appropriately filtered, then yes, a PPVL design would be appropriate, in my opinion, for a BMT unit.
On the next page, question 10, what issues arise with the PPVL neutral pressure design? Are there particular issues that arise with that compared to, say, a negative pressure room or positive pressure room?
At the time that this was written, the HBN 0401, a PPVL incorporates a lobby entrance. At the time, HBN 0401 did not specify lobbies on positive or negative pressure isolation rooms. That has since been updated, and the latest HBN guidance now specifies that lobbies should be provided for all isolation rooms, be positive, negative, or neutral pressure. But obviously they take up more floor space because you have to accommodate a lobby area, and ideally, particularly if you are dealing with category 3 and certainly category 4 pathogens, then the lobbies have to be large enough to facilitate at least 2 people, one person donning or doffing protective equipment and the other person described as a donning or doffing buddy to make sure that said PPE is appropriately applied and removed safely to protect both patient and staff.
And that's a very recent update of the guidance.
That was updated within the past few months.
My lord, this might be an appropriate point to pause.
Yes, as I said, Mr. Poplett, we take a coffee break. So could I ask you to be back for 12 o'clock? Mr. Conn.
Right, my Lord. Can I just take you back to something that we discussed earlier, Mr. Poplett? In your executive summary, you said, well, what should you do in this situation? And your sort of starting point was to say, well, let's have a full multidisciplinary assessment, looking at all these areas, and try and work out basically what ought properly to be done. And then once you've decided what that is, you can think of the practicalities. Does that involve moving patients or whatever? I want to ask you this. If let's say for the sake of argument, we took all the areas in which you thought there were ventilation deficiencies, what you describe as suboptimal, whether it's chill beams or air change rates or whatever, and you were to have some kind of multidisciplinary multidisciplinary exercise to look at all of these. Do you think it would assist in the circumstances we have here if there was some perhaps external body leading that, or independent or external party leading that, in order to direct what was to happen?
I think if there was external sort of facilitating of that exercise, it may be beneficial. However, ultimately, it's the people at the hospital who know all of the detail. It's the detail of the clinicians, of the IPC people, who ultimately have got to input and balance the risks. Having no facility is almost always going to be worse than having a suboptimal facility, but that doesn't mean that a suboptimal facility should be the final outcome. It is external sort of structuring and organising may well have benefit, because for want of a better term, they will have less skin in the game, but it has to be driven by the people who know the detailed specific issues relating to the site and the clinical cases in question.
Thank you. We'll move back to where we were in your report. We were on page 514. And I just want to pick up a technical point again, so we're understanding what you're telling us. We're talking in this section about air permeability and so on. And we see in 738, you're saying achieving low levels of air permeability is essential, and so on. Can you help us understand the calculations you're talking about in 7.39, where you're talking about them being recommended by, I'm not sure how you say that acronym, BISRIA. What are you explaining there about lower levels and higher levels?
It's basically a figure that has been derived and specified through BISRA to give an acceptable leakage rate. You will never get it 100% zero leakage. The very nature of any space, any building, there will always be a degree of air permeability. It is applied both positively and negatively. So you want to, if you like, try to inflate the balloon and also suck the balloon air out to make sure that air doesn't move in either direction in a given circumstance. And the exact technical nature of the tests is laid out within the BISRA guidance. But it's to basically make sure that you have a low level of overall leakage in either direction, and you have predictable air paths. So if you are housing an infectious disease, it's not transferring from one room to the room adjacent to it. If you've got to sterilise or disinfect that room, having held an infectious disease patient, by a vaporising disinfection process, then you again don't want that leaking out into areas that may still be occupied. So it's about making sure that you've got predictable air paths and as close as is reasonably achievable to not fully airtight, but a low level of leakage.
A very technical question, page 515, paragraph 7.41. There's an acronym that I couldn't find. It's probably my fault. ATTMA standards. What's ATTMA?
Again, I would need to go and look those particular standards up, but they are the US standards for the same process, is my understanding.
Thank you. The section of your report that we've now reached goes on to deal with chill beams. Now, we've talked about chill beams a bit already, so I'm not going to get you to read through all of this because you actually quote a lot of the issues in the next few pages, and then you come on to something else that we've touched on, which is thermal wheels. We've had some evidence about those already. Now, your view as to what might best be done appears at page 519 in paragraph 751. In effect, you're not recommending the use of thermal wheels in an area with any immunocompromised risk. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that simply because there are other things you can do?
There are other technologies available that are, in my opinion, more robust. Thermal wheels do have a very small level of potential crossover of extract air back into the supply air. That isn't my fundamental issue with thermal wheels. Thermal wheels work by passing the air over a very complex matrix arrangement, which gives time for the air to impart its heat or coolth to the material. It then rotates, continuously rotates, back into the other airstream, be it extract or supply. Because of the matrix nature of the material, unless they are incredibly well maintained and kept clean, they can suffer from blockage, and that has a serious impact on the overall airflow rates through them. So it's more to do with the maintainability rather than any other fundamental design issue with thermal wheels, and the difficulty operationally that you encounter trying to switch these systems off to undertake maintenance, whereas with a runaround coil or a cross-flow heat exchanger, they are less prone to blocking in use, and the maintenance procedures are more robust for less time input.
Thank you. The topic you then touch on relatively briefly is what you describe as the ventilation system resilience. And the first topic is one that we've heard about from other witnesses, which is essentially that you have a performance of a piece of kit when new and installed, and then it deteriorates even with proper maintenance. Is that right?
Correct.
And you need to bear that in mind when you're planning. And does that have an impact if you've put in a system which by design has to run full tilt all the time?
Yes.
And you give us this the 3 R's, a new version at 755 on page 520. The 3 resilience principles. Where do you get these from?
They are they're the basis for designing a resilient system. So the initial system needs to be robust. You need to be able to have redundancy or duplication where necessary, and if need be, reconfiguring the way that a system works to ensure that you maintain its function, even if there is a single point of failure.
So well, let me just go to 756, where you instance what you say is good practice. And that's either backup or some kind of standby resilience or something to cover the risk of failure. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that for all systems, or is it of particular significance for those for special areas?
It is of greater importance for a critical ventilation system than a general non-critical ventilation system.
And then in the next paragraph, you deal with your comment on BREEAM, which we've picked up from you already. The next section, you deal with 2 topics that we've also heard something about: commissioning, which is what the contractor does, and then validation, which we've heard should be done by or on behalf of the client. Is that right?
Correct.
And that's covered by the HTM guidance.
It is.
And I see in page 524, you've quoted a quote that we've been given by other witnesses, from which I take it this is something that's intended to be done before you take on the ward or unit or whatever it is that is being validated. You do this first before you put people in it, for instance. Is that
yes.
right? And then what you do is you...
If I could just clarify something, Mr. Poplett. When you're discussing validation in Chapter 8, am I right in thinking it's looking at the SHTM, either in its 2014 edition or 2022, you're not looking at anything else? I mean, what I have in mind is that the guidance envisages validation. Guidance envisages validation before handover, and the guidance envisages that if validation is not satisfactory, the health authority does not accept the building. But that's just what the guidance says. The contract might say something entirely different.
It may do, yes.
I just wanted to pick up one point. I don't think we need read through the list of things that the validator should check for. But I was just interested in your comment on something that crops up on page 526, where you say, well, the note says the validation is not a snagging inspection. So does that mean then that you shouldn't have a validation report which says, well, this is fine except for the following 9 things that still need fixed? Is that the way it's supposed to work?
That certainly should be the case, yes. It isn't always the case, but the system, if it's been, or the systems, if they've been fully commissioned, then snagging should be taken care of at that point. And the validation should just be exactly what it is, the validation that everything works and works together. They shouldn't be finding basic snagging items during a validation.
And is that why the guidance has the bit that you've quoted at the foot of 526, that if you hit a lot of snags, what you're meant to do is stop and say, come back when you're ready? in effect.
Yes.
And then you comment on the next couple of pages about commissioning and validation, and we know there wasn't any validation. Then on 528, you come on to operation and maintenance, and you pick up on a board systems policy from February 2020. Interestingly, referencing SHTM. And you have a brief comment about that policy on page 529 in paragraph 9.2. I suppose this is a comment that could be made about a lot of things that are described as policies, that you say, well, it's generic. Do you think it should be more detailed? Is that what your point is?
I think if you have an overarching or generic policy, then there needs or should be sufficient detailed standard operating procedures underpinning it. The policy should state what they're going to do. The procedures detail how it's going to be delivered.
Now, the other point that you make in that paragraph is that the policy doesn't make any reference to the, whether you call them derogations or suboptimal performances, and doesn't deal with that at all. Would you expect that to be dealt with as a matter of policy?
If it had been signed off and ratified, then it should have acknowledged the fact that it was operating at a less than fully compliant level.
Because you were asked a question about that in your Direction 5 questions. You asked, we'll just go to these, please, at page 151. At the foot of that page, you asked, what's the basis for your conclusion? I'm just dealing with paragraph 9.1 at the moment. And you say the basis of your conclusion was that the policy document clearly stated that full compliance to SHTM was required and made no reference to derogations. Is that the point you're making?
Yes.
And thank you. Well, we'll come back to the other part of that question shortly. Page 530, you touch on PPM, wearing your hat as a former estates manager and now AE. Is PPM important for the successful operation of a complex hospital?
Absolutely critical.
Did you see any indication that when this hospital was handed over, there were systems in place for PPM?
There was evidence provided to say that the PPM systems were not fully in place and that a number of estates' focuses were on reactive or addressing defects or snagging items rather than delivering planned preventative maintenance.
Now, I think you make in 9.4 a plea for more people again. Is that right? You may need more people because too many people are wearing too many hats. Is that correct?
Yes, the role and function of an authorised person, and there are APs for the majority of engineering disciplines within a hospital, carry with them some onerous and significant functions, and individuals need to have enough time to do those adequately and appropriately. And a lack of appropriate numbers either leads to short coverage areas, so during sickness, holidays, absences, or it means that the job doesn't get done or executed to the correct level of detail that it should be.
And then you set out some of the details about authorised persons, roles and so on in the next pages, touching on a number of the APs that are required. And we'll leave parties to read that. So if we go on to another section, which is a ventilation safety group, at page 536. Now, I suppose the first question is this. Do you need to have a requirement in guidance to have a VSG before you decide to have one? Any requirement to wait until it's there?
No.
Now, I think I'm right in understanding that you were one of the drafters of the provisions on ventilation safety groups. Is that correct?
I was, yes.
So you presumably think they're a good idea?
I do.
And just briefly tell us why.
The ventilation safety group's core function is to provide a means of assurance and ensure the multidisciplinary working of all of the various parties involved. So it is not an estates meeting that's run by estates. It's not an IPC meeting that's run by IPC. It involves all of the stakeholders involved, where they can discuss and debate issues and hopefully act as a means of assurance provision that can be reported back up through whatever committee structure the organisation has, back up to board level, that in this case, ventilation systems are safe and appropriate, or if issues do exist, they can escalate them through a risk assessment process to highlight that attention and potentially finance is required to address or improve those areas.
Is the presence of different disciplines a significant part of what you envisage for VSG?
Yes.
And I take it you accept that so far as guidance is concerned, the requirement for VSG didn't appear until some years after this hospital was opened.
It wasn't documented in the SHTM until its latest iteration, but similar groups with near identical terms of reference existed for water systems and electrical systems well before. And it's not, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We took the best elements of all of those in constructing the guidance within the ventilation standard.
Were you aware that there was a ventilation safety group at this hospital from 2019, which met, I think the word sporadically might be the best picture. Did you know about that?
I haven't seen detailed minutes or notes from it, but yes, it doesn't surprise me that it did exist. The HTM and SHTM were actually completed in terms of the drafting process by early 2019. So within the industry, the content of it was well known by 2019 prior to its eventual publication in 2021.
And what you then do in your report is you set out details of the aim, the roles and functions of a VSG, who should be on the VSG, how often it should meet, what its terms of reference should be, and so on. Is that right?
Correct.
Well, let's move on to another topic, verification. So we've got this probably in our heads by now here, that commissioning is done by the contractor, then the client comes along and gets somebody to do validation for them, and then some systems should be verified. Now, is it all systems or just some systems?
All critical systems should be verified annually.
Annually. have you, in the course of the materials you've been provided with, seen any evidence of annual verifications being carried out?
In some areas, yes.
And you set out on page 543, we just moved there, what the aim of the verification is, and so on, and what the standards are. So we needn't get you to deal with that. Can I move you on then to a not unconnected topic, which is audit? Am I right in thinking that in your capacity as an AE, you're very familiar with having to do audits?
Yes.
And is there a set format, or do people have their individual approaches to this?
There is no prescribed set format for an audit process, but it should cover the same general areas as outlined within the standard. There are more recently been produced some software systems which dictate a prescribed format for the audit, but there is no requirement for an AE to adopt any generic format.
Is one of the issues, and maybe you can help us as an AE, what the issues with an audit? Is it taken at a particular point in time?
It is very much a snapshot in time, and relies on sampling of records rather than a detailed review of every single record, just given the nature and scale of the issues involved.
Well, apart from ticking a box that says we need to have an audit, tick, we've had one, what's the point of doing these audits? What should the objective be?
The point should be to provide an independent level of assurance that the ventilation systems are being appropriately managed.
We know from your report that you are, perhaps I might describe it as gently critical of the audit in this hospital. Is that right?
It wouldn't be how I would have done it over the period of audit reports which I reviewed.
Perhaps so the inquiry can see what we're talking about when we talk about an audit report. If we go to page 546, the first one that you look at is, and you actually set out some of its contents on the next page or so, might be helpful for the inquiry just to look at an example of what this audit system looks like. So could we have bundle 20, page 94, please? So we start with terms of reference, SHTM, executive summary, then a report summary. And if we scroll on, do we also see areas where the nice simple labeling of things as yellow, amber, or red is also adopted? Is that right?
Correct.
So if we just scroll on, what does it mean, for instance, where we see, safe system of, or this is the key to the assessments, isn't it? This indicates what they mean. Is that right?
It is a assessment based upon a risk rating to say whether something is good, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, hazardous, or unsafe.
Yeah. So red means unsafe.
Correct.
So if we scroll on this document, we see a number of items labeled in red. Now, is that for the current audit, or is this referencing back to an earlier audit period?
My understanding is this would be from the current audit. Sorry, this is the previous action plan. So this is what was found the previous year.
So if we just scroll on, we'll see what else. There's some more red, some green, one or two amber, and so on. We just finished the document so we see exactly what it covers. Some more red on the next page. Carry on, please. And then there are a series of reports. What's the most critical piece of the audit report to look at, Mr. Poplett, if you were picking it up as an interested reader?
I mean, to be fair, all of the audit report is important. There shouldn't be anything in there that's not. But obviously, the number of critical or red items should be highlighting the most fundamentally at-risk areas. And what you are ideally wanting to see is, over a pattern of audits, a continuous improvement, with items that had been previously raised being addressed and completed, or moving from, in this case, red to green.
Let's see. Now, you asked one or two questions about the audit process in your Direction 5 questions. Let me just look at these briefly. If we go to page 150 of the questions, there we are, looking at question 13. Now, the question is put in a slightly odd way, but it says, did the ventilation audit fail to provide a reason for withdrawal of the action to provide a standby handling unit for 4B? Is your answer essentially saying this is not what the audit's doing?
Yes, I mean, it covers operational issues and didn't extend to cover ongoing or planned project or improvement works.
So the same with the next question, did the 2006 ventilation audit fail to identify an infection control risk assessment for filters in NICU? And you're saying, well, it's only looking at operational matters.
It only really relates to estates operational.
Let's see. Thank you. Now, if we just go back, we perhaps leave the 2016 audit for the moment, thank you, and we'll return to page 546 of your report, Mr. Poplett. I mean, did you see the evidence of improvement that you wanted to see when you went through the audit report?
It's not really for me to say whether it was what I would want to see. There were a number of issues that appeared repeatedly across the years that didn't appear to have progressed over those years, which was surprising.
Yeah, I think a phrase is used such as ongoing or something of that kind.
Yes.
Now that may be an accurate reflection of the fact that whatever was supposed to be done last time is still being done. Is that an adequate response to the issue in your view?
Depending upon the seriousness of the issue under review, it may be appropriate, but it would normally be accompanied with an explanatory note as to why it was ongoing, or if progress had been made, but still not sufficient progress to close out the action in its entirety.
And is that what you saw when you ploughed through these? I mean, we can look at them all if we need to, but were you seeing explanations as to, for instance, why an action hadn't been closed down?
No, I was seeing repetition rather than explanation.
Now, that you looked at, I think that was 2016, page 546. 2017, you touched on page 548. 2018, you touch on page 549. Now, you particularly instanced the way that started by saying steady good progress has been made under the direction of the compliance manager and interim site manager of operational estate. Some issues remain unresolved and are placing the board at risk. Now, do you agree that that should be given the label of good progress?
When measuring just the estate's progress, I don't think it was completely unfair to say progress was being made. But the fact that there were other fundamental areas that had not progressed, in my opinion, should have been escalated or elevated to a higher risk status.
Because I think we see from your report on page 551 that a not dissimilar opening was found to the 2019 audit report and indeed the 2020 audit report. So we come to your conclusion. I think there is some challenge to why you say this. So let's look at precisely what you say on page 553, paragraph 9.89. So your position, which you just explained to me a moment ago, was that you were concerned about the number of things which remained in the audit system as requiring to be addressed. That's what your concern was.
Yes.
And you described the tone of the executive summary as overly reassuring. Now, why do you say that?
If you didn't recognise the estate's only focus of the audit report and read only the executive summary of the report, it gave the impression that everything was generally okay. There were fundamental issues relating to issues that we have discussed already that I would not have been comfortable putting in those terms. The fact that there were statutory issues such as fire damper drop testing, which wasn't completely 100% achieved, is a significant risk to the entire facility potentially. And yet it was repeatedly reported as ongoing or progress being made.
And what do you think of the speed of progress over the years that you examined them?
The speed of progress in general terms is always linked to the level of resource availability. So with more people and more funds available, could things have been put right quicker? Probably. Some of the fundamental issues, as we've already discussed, aren't something that can necessarily be rectified in the site's current configuration.
I just want to take the next logical step in your comment here. It's probably the easiest way I can do that is to look at one of your direction 5 questions, which appears at page 151 of that document at the foot. And we'll be looking at paragraph 9.89, which is your conclusions on the audit. And the question which we touched on a little earlier in relation to a different paragraph is now, what is the basis for your conclusion reached in 9.8.9? And you say in your answer 18.2 a number of the issues identified as non-conformities as a potentially significant risk to patient safety and legal compliance. Then you say, and should have been escalated. Now, is that something that you would expect to see mentioned in the audit report, or is that just a matter of fact?
As an auditor, I would ask, has this been escalated higher? If it had, I would want evidence of that. If it hadn't, then via my audit report, it would act as a route of escalation.
So if you don't see it mentioned in the audit report, what, you assume it hasn't happened?
Yes.
And in question 19, where you're asked, you know, why do you say it's overly reassuring? And you partly answered that question already. You deal with escalation in the last sentence. Is this part of the auditor's job to sort of prod somebody about these things?
Yes. The AE is not just there to audit or assess potential APs, they're also there to assist and support the organisation. And part of that needs to be to highlight where there are issues and, wherever possible, contribute to the potential solutions.
And I mean, obviously you've looked at the audit reports. Have you seen any evidence of the escalation of the issues that gave rise to your concerns?
Not beyond the audit report itself, no.
And the final question that you were asked in the Direction 5 questions, and which to some extent we've already dealt with, is what's the basis for stating the speed and extent of improvement was poor? I just wanted to look at the second part of your answer there, because that gives an indication as to what you think might have been done that you didn't see being done. Is that right?
Correct.
A director lead task and finish group, what's that?
It's if you have a specific issue or problem, it is not unusual to put in a senior member of staff to look at a task and finish. So look at that specific problem, identify solutions, and then monitor progress on delivering those solutions. And the advantage of a director-led is that they have the authority and the direct reporting to the board in terms of progress to address and complete a given issue.
Thank you. Well, let's leave audits and let's go back to your report, please, on page 553. And let's touch on another topic, derogation management. Which you describe as often complex and potentially contentious. Do you think I'm going to look at this at least briefly, the detail you've set out in your report. In your opinion, is the management of derogations, by which I assume we're meaning departures from standard guidance, generally, is that important, how you manage that?
Yes, critical in my opinion.
And why do you say it's critical?
A derogation or deviation from the standard may be agreed at the time of a project, but the use and type of how that area within a facility is used changes and evolves over time. It is critically important that if a derogation is agreed for sound and valid reasons for one clinical use, if the clinical profile of the patient changes over time, if the clinical function changes or the nature of the activity changes, then that derogation may no longer be appropriate. And it may have been appropriate at the point when it was agreed. So a derogation is for life. It's not just for the project. So it needs to be effectively recorded the risk assessment adequately recorded involving all aspects, the agreement made at a sufficient level within the organisation, and then that derogation should be kept under continuous review to ensure that it remains safe and appropriate, and the basis on which it was agreed hasn't changed.
Given the issues this inquiry has to deal with, would you be suggesting that this is a topic that the inquiry needs to look at?
I have a personal and professional issue with the whole management of derogations. I do not believe currently there is a sufficiently robust or detailed guidance in existence to help organisations through the derogation process. Within the latest version of SHTM 0301 and every other HTM and HBN, there is a clear statement that derogations should not be considered unless they can be evidenced to provide something equal or better than full compliance would deliver. Now, that is in some cases optimistic if you are undertaking projects on an existing hospital estate, and therefore the need for derogation is legitimate, but it must be, in my personal opinion, very carefully managed and controlled to make sure decisions taken at one point in time remain safe and appropriate throughout the operational of that facility.
I think you're highlighting two what sound to me rather different points. As you say, that if we look at the 2022 version of SHTM 0301, the criterion of equal or, we see the criterion of equal or better. Now, do I take from your answer that you think that's maybe too high, either an inappropriate criterion or too high a criterion?
No, I think it is highly appropriate, but I think it needs to be looked at pragmatically, in that there are times when derogation will be appropriate. But where it is appropriate, there is an ongoing obligation to manage and keep it under review.
Now, that was the second point that I took from what you had to say, and I think I see the logic of it. Derogation may be appropriate at one point of time, things move on, perhaps a different use of the space, therefore you've got to keep it under control. I think I've got that. What I think I have not got was the way you may or may not have interlinked what seemed to me to be different points. So can you help me on that?
The first point could be interpreted as don't derogate unless you can prove that you're going to do something better than compliance would deliver. That in an operational healthcare facility is not pragmatically practical. So it's more about saying, don't derogate. If you do something equal or better, agreed and supported. Where derogation is essential, it has to be fully documented and then kept as an ongoing review issue. Because it is naive to say, well, everything should be fully compliant in every scenario. The example I gave earlier on isolation rooms, anything built prior to July 2024, you could have a negative pressure or a positive pressure that didn't need a lobby. From July 2024, you now would need a lobby. Now, the HBN is not retrospective, but the clinical risk and the evidence now based on saying you should have a lobby is fact. So should you review any isolation facilities that don't currently have lobbies? Yes.
And did you, or did you not, and perhaps you can make sure we're getting this correctly, in the discussion that you've just had, which was supplemented by questions from the chair, did you distinguish between a proposal for a new development, doesn't have to be a hospital, could be a health centre or whatever it was, and what might crop up in the course of an operational, ongoing, working hospital or health centre? Now, are these different for the purposes of what you're telling us about?
Potentially, yes. Within a brand new build, then you should be able to do it right and do it right first time. It is always cheaper to build it once and not have to modify. If you've got an existing footprint, you are governed by the footprint that you are working within, what resource availability, clinical availability is. So it may mean that you have to compromise on some elements, but any such compromise has got to be fully assessed to determine it is safe and appropriate to do so.
So what you've done in your report, as I understand it, is you've said, well, there's not much in the guidance, and you've just quoted effectively what the guidance says. And therefore, what you've set out is the version according to Poplett about derogations. Is that right?
Yep, that is completely fair. There may be better ways of doing it. Anyone who can come up with a better way, I will be happy to look at and change my view if it improves it. But in light of or lack of current written guidance, that is my view on how derogations should be managed.
So if we go to page 554, you start off with the basics, like you have to appropriately record it. The implications have to be understood and accepted by all parties and approved at an agreed appropriate level. Is that important, getting the right level of person involved?
Absolutely critical.
And where applicable, alternative and equivalent mitigation agreed for the risks. So that would be possibly more easily exemplified in an ongoing healthcare situation where you would decide you needed to do A, which isn't according to the guidance, and because you were doing A, you added some protection in. Is that right?
Correct.
And you mentioned in 993, clear auditable trail. Then you say derogations to guidance will potentially increase risks. Is that your view?
Potentially, yes.
And then your view is that they should only be considered in exceptional circumstances.
Correct.
And then you make the point about ongoing review that you made in response to a question from His Lordship. Risk assessment, is that important? You mentioned that in 995.
Yes.
Just help me with 996. You say derogations must be properly authorised by the project's senior responsible owner and informed and supported by appropriate technical, IPC and clinical advice. And you say irrespective of a project's internal or external approval processes. What's the point you're trying to make there about the irrespective?
It can't be decided within the project team. It must go back to the owner operator, for want of a better term, or health board, to accept or reject any proposed derogation.
Sure. On the next page, 555, you're picking up a number of guidance documents and so on, and you make the point that they can become legal requirements if they're incorporated into contracts. Now, at paragraph 9-100, just help me with this. Is this a reference to a legal obligation that's incumbent on the healthcare provider that you're making there?
It is my attempt to highlight that whilst Department of Health standards or guidance, HTMs, are not legal documents in and of themselves, they do form the basis of, in what my understanding would be, an approved code of practice. And that is reflected in the current statements made in the preface of all new HTMs that derogation should only be considered if you can prove that what you're doing is equal or better.
You then, in 101 and 102 and so on, highlight a particular statute, in fact more than one. Am I right in thinking that that's legislation which applies in England and Wales?
It is.
Nine 106 on 557, minimum standard or best practice. Why did you pick that heading?
An HTM covers a wide range of areas, and in some cases it clearly states they are minimum acceptable standards. In other cases they could be interpreted as best practice. So it varies upon which part of the document you read as to whether it is an absolute requirement, a minimum standard, or this should be done if at all possible. Hence why the minimum standard or best practice is in, and why I state it is subject which is highly contentious and you can get a whole range of opinions on. My belief is that it should all be considered as at least minimum standard, unless it can be documented as to why it shouldn't be.
And then you've got a heading, reasons to consider derogating. Now, are these things that you've picked up from your experience, or you find them somewhere?
Yep, they are certainly all areas that I have come across during my career where a derogation has been necessary for varying reasons.
Especially about your comment on cost. I mean, do you derogate because it's going to cost too much money?
I have certainly seen derogations proposed that they want to derogate because there is a cheaper alternate, but it should not, in my opinion, ever be used as the sole driver for a derogation.
And presumably the scope of project, the one at the top of 558, omission of issue at business case design construction stage, is that where something has been missed out and somebody saying, well, we missed it out, so let's not bother?
It's where something can have been missed out and therefore not. It depends upon at which point you undertake these reviews. If you are reviewing something at the validation stage and you identify that something was never intended to be included and was missed, that should not be the basis of a derogation, although if the omission does not have any significant implication to the fundamental operation of the facility, a derogation could be considered retrospectively.
I'd just like to take the next paragraph from your 9108. And you say what you've said earlier, full implications must be carefully balanced, full and detailed record made, formal review process may identify other forms of mitigation. The last sentence of that paragraph, is that your opinion? Highly unusual to seek derogations on a new build project.
It should be, yes.
At the moment, as we stand today, we don't have any additional documentation other than the limited item that you referred to earlier to show why the derogation was done, what was done about it, or anything else? Is it premature to form any conclusion as to whether that was a good idea or not?
In my opinion, it should, or if a derogation was a conscious decision, that decision must be fully documented to justify why it was taken.
Well, I'm conscious of the time. Any point is probably as good as another.
We'll take our lunch break now, Mr. Poplett, and if I could ask you to be back for 2 o'clock.